Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is lecture 26 in the history series, the history of first-year art instruction. I'm going to talk about four different topics here, and these are the four different components of the first-year instruction that come from different periods in history. So the first year, or the foundation year in art schools and academies, is a mixture usually of lessons that come from different historical periods, and it helps to know the origins of the different exercises you learn because they don't all fit together, they don't all go together. They come from four main historical periods, and each of them had different goals for art. So they sometimes actually contradict each other, so it's useful to know that and to see how they fit or don't fit. So here's a table, which I'll be following through the whole lecture. I took this off a lecture that I gave in China, so everything's also translated to Chinese. So the first of the four models that influence contemporary first-year art instruction, I'm calling the French Academy. You could call it just academic European art if you'd like to. It refers to especially the period around the 18th century. It corresponds with Baroque and neoclassical art. But basically, we're talking here about what you would have learned if you were an art student from the end of the Renaissance up until the beginning of the 19th century or so. The time periods don't really matter. What matters the most is that some of the things that are still taught in the first year in studios come ultimately from the French and other European academies in that time period. The second model for first-year art instruction is what's usually called the Romantic Academy. They didn't call them that at the time. These are not romantic as in romance, but romantic as in the Romantic period, early 19th century, mostly in Germany. And the art period of that time was Romantic painting, poetry, drama, and so on. The third model in first-year art instruction is the Bauhaus. And that's the height of its influence was the 30s, 40s, into the 50s. So German modernist art school. And then in general, there's also material that's taught that came out of post-war art schools. That is us, everything from the Second World War to the present. And that's, in general terms, the art period that goes with that is postmodernism. So you can see this is very schematic. But it actually fits the bill pretty well, as I'll show. So I'll talk a little bit about each of the first three and look at how they influence contemporary foundation year, first year art instruction. The idea is to be able to think about one of the exercises that you're asked to do and see what period it came from and how it fits or doesn't fit with some of the other exercises that you will do in the same year. Each of these three periods that I'm going to focus on is going to start with a couple of screens of background historical information, just because it's sometimes useful to get some like anchoring points in history. And I'm just going to use this picture that I took of a cut section of a tree that's in a park in Oregon. So the first of these on the table, the first one I'll be talking about is the French Academy. And there's a close-up of the center of the tree with some of the time markers that they had posted there. So the first academy was founded in 1563 in Florence, so like there, wherever exactly. And there's more about that in Concepts Lecture 7. The actual French Academy, the academy in Paris, was founded in 1655, and that was the most influential academy for a number of centuries. Then if we zoom out a little bit, starting from the bottom there, academies based on the French Academy spread throughout Europe in the 18th century. At one point, there were over 300 academies in Europe. So that's what I'm calling French Academy, means all of them. And then on the right, starting from the second to the top, academies were still being founded in the early 20th century. Nanjing Academy, for example, was founded in 1906. And conservative academy-inspired institutions are still appearing. There are, for example, in Japan and Korea, art high schools that prep students for art universities that often have very conservative agendas. So This idea of the French Academy as an institution, it still exists, and there are a number of them that are relatively new in different parts of the world. Okay, so here are two characteristics of the French Academy that remain in current first-year instruction. Of course, a lot of things have gone, but here are two things that are still around that you'll encounter in your own studio experiences. So first of all, the emphasis on drawing. In the French Academy, drawing was fundamental, and for several centuries, it's all that was taught. If you wanted to study painting, sculpture, and other media, you had to go to workshops. You had to go apprentice yourself to artists outside the academy. Actually, it's a really bad choice of a drawing because they're actually painting there, but that's a later print. So the idea of emphasizing drawing was that if you, as an artist, learned what they call disegno, that's also in another lecture on design, if you learned it, you could create anything in any medium. So the notion was drawing was fundamental because it would impart the skill of disegno, and then you could work in any medium. So all they taught was drawing. Today, it's different. Drawing has this kind of twilight existence because faculty can't agree on exactly what the status of drawing is. So sometimes drawing is a department. In some art schools, it's a department of drawing. In others, it's a concentration or a stream and so on, because nobody can quite agree on who owns it, who owns drawing, if anybody does. Drawing is sometimes a requirement and sometimes an elective for the same reason, because faculty can't agree if it's really the foundational art for all, skill for all of arts or not. Sometimes drawing is thought of as a medium, and other times it's thought of as a universal tool. I've been involved in conversations in art schools when they're rethinking their curriculum, and this question often comes up, and it's very seldom resolved. There are usually a couple of faculty who would say, well, drawing is absolutely fundamental and you can't do anything without drawing, and then there will others who will say the exact opposite. So you could decide for yourself what place drawing has in your own practice. You can ask yourself, is drawing really for you just one strategy among many different ways of making art? Or is there something foundational about it so that really if you can think in drawing, if you can work in drawing, that you can work in many other media and techniques? And if you think that way, then you are tending back in the direction of the French Academy, what I'm calling the French Academy idea, that drawing was so fundamental that an academy really only needed to teach drawing and didn't have to teach anything else. So what you want to watch for in your studio classes is the place that drawing is given. Is it something that just is used as one tool among others in passing, or is it something that is given to you at first as a kind of foundational thing, or is it that's returned to often as a kind of a foundational skill? So a second characteristic of the French Academy that remains in current first-year instruction is the idea of life classes. In the French Academy, life drawing was also fundamental for two different reasons. First, because the human body was a reflection of the divine. When the first academies opened at the end of the Renaissance, that was, of course, still Christian culture. And there was a lot of religious art was being made. It was one of the principal things that an artist could do to make religious art, and the body was a reflection of the divine. So there was a very good reason to do life drawing then. And in the centuries leading up to modernism, European artists all made figural narrative paintings. So there were figures in them. So another reason to always do to privilege life drawing classes. Neither of those reasons to learn life drawing pertain in contemporary art. So we've become completely detached from the idea that the human body reflects a divine essence or form, and very few artists make narrative figural paintings, and yet life drawing is still practiced in every art school and department. So you could ask, what justifies life drawing classes today? And the reasons that are given are really, I think they're really odd. It's often said, for example, instructors will say, well, the human form is really, really hard to draw. I never understood that. When I was in my own MFA program, I was a painter before I was an art historian. When I was in my own program, I had a really hard time drawing things like cars and toasters. I think they're just as hard to draw as the human form. I don't think that's really an adequate reason for having life drawing classes. And of course, life drawing classes are full of social and sexual and political overtones and undertones, which get ignored in order to promote the idea that it's just a formal exercise. I mean, an awful lot gets swept under the rug in order to continue this enterprise of life drawing, which is not justified in the ways that it used to be. So we have a very unresolved relation, I think, to the history when it comes to life drawing. We continue to practice it, but we hardly ever discuss why. Among the many confused reasons are the remnant of these old ideas from European academies, from the French academies, I'm calling it, that the human form is somehow divine or sacred or ideal or something like that, and that figural representation is somehow a fundamental concern of art. I'm not advocating to get rid of life drawing, but I am advocating an awareness of the fact that there were once reasons that put it front and center in the art curriculum, and those reasons are gone, and we're not so good at talking about it anymore. The second of the periods I want to concentrate on, which was the second row of that table, was the Romantic Academy. So here's the timeline again. Romantic academies were very small, independent institutions, mostly in Germany, starting around 1810. So again, two characteristics of Romantic academies that remain in first-year instruction. First of all, the idea of learning from a master, quote unquote. In the French Academy, everybody learned in groups. Usually you would be drawing from the same model. Sometimes it was a live model, sometimes a plaster cast, and so on. But you would learn, everyone in the room would be drawing, so you would learn in groups. Romantic academies shifted that to one-on-one relationships between the quote-unquote master and the student. There's something very, so this obviously still exists, especially at MFA level, where you would have like an advisor and study from them. But there's something very interesting about this that's often overlooked, that in the Romantic academies, the idea of having a master was not actually to emulate your master's, quote-unquote master's style. The idea was you were supposed to learn from your instructor's example how to be unique. And then you were supposed to find your own equally unique manner. So you weren't supposed to have the master's style necessarily, but you were supposed to learn see the achievement that your instructor had gotten of being a person in their own right with a style and a manner and a way of making art in their own right, and to emulate the idea of uniqueness in yourself. This is still very much the idea, the assumption that underlies contemporary MFA programs, where the idea is that you're supposed to find your own voice or your style or your practice. But it also happens in first-year programs. Whenever your instructor's work or their career or their voice or their style becomes the subject of conversation, that's an inheritance of the Romantic Academy, that you're at that point, in theory, learning from the uniqueness or the individuality of your instructor. Okay, the second characteristic of Romantic academies that's still around in current first-year art instruction is the idea of expression. So in the French Academy, the idea was to copy nature, to work on your skills of naturalistic representation. But the Romantics overturned that, and from the 19th century onward, art has been imagined as a way to express yourself, your own inner thoughts and feelings. I'm going to do more about this in the next lecture, so I won't say much more about that here, just that this idea that art is all about expression is absolutely universal now, and it was absolutely absent before the Romantics and before the French Academy got started as well. Artists were always praised for their skills at emulating nature. If you think of the master narrative and Gombrich's idea of the rise of naturalism. And now it's absolutely taken for granted that it really doesn't matter how well you can represent nature, provided that you can express yourself in an interesting way. So this is so universal today that basically nobody questions it. It's just that art is the way we express ourselves. In first-year programs, this idea is mixed in conflicting ways sometimes with the older French Academy model of naturalistic skill. Actually, these two are opposites. So that's also a useful thing to bear in mind, that sometimes in some exercises in the first year, the goal is expression. So your work will be talked about as an expression, your expression of your feelings, expression of your thoughts. And at other times in the first year, your work will be talked about as something that shows skills in representing the outside world, architecture or portraits or things like that, any kind of naturalistic work. Those are two actually opposite goals in art, and it was a big change when Romanticism appeared and art turned inward, as they say. Okay, the last of the three that I'm going to talk about, even though there's four, but the last of the three I want to talk about here is the Bauhaus. So on the timeline, the Bauhaus was established in 1919. In the 1920s, that's when the Bauhaus influence began to spread. And it's important to know, if you're looking at the Bauhaus, if you start to look into it, that the reason it was so influential was not just kind of like they were so innovative in an abstract way. It was because they were always publishing things. And the publications went around Europe to America and around the world. And since these videos are for the School of the Art Institute, I have to say also Moholy-Nagy, one of the people who worked at the Bauhaus, opened the Chicago branch of the Bauhaus in 1939. So Chicago is part of the inheritance of the Bauhaus in a very concrete way. And the Bauhaus model then spread after the Second World War, along with the spread of MFA programs. MFA programs largely did not exist before the Second World War, and they spread in the 1960s especially, but beginning after World War II. And so they took the Bauhaus model with them and made it even more influential. Okay, so three characteristics of the Bauhaus that are still around in first-year art instruction. First is the tabula rasa, the blank slate. The instructors at the Bauhaus were interested in de-skilling their students in order to remove bad academic habits that they might have learned in art classes before they got to the Bauhaus. And there's more on that in another lecture if you want to follow that up. In some classes, they even had students do calisthenics to erase poor habits of motion and pose. All these photos I have are from the original Bauhaus in these next few slides. In my own MFA program, one of my teachers was a student of Albers, one of the main Bauhaus artists. And so I had to do these things, not calisthenics, but I was asked to, for example, do an exercise in which you take a pencil in your hand and you go round and round in the air. You go round and round in the air, making a circle. And then when you think you've got a perfect circle, you just let your pencil down onto the page so that it makes one circle and see if it's perfect. And then you go on, you move to the right, you go round and round in the air in a circle, and you put down your pencil in one place. You keep doing that on big sheets of butcher paper until you've made yourself into a kind of machine. You've de-skilled yourself in the sense that you have gotten rid of bad habits of motion and made yourself ready kinesthetically. In your muscular sense, has been retaught. You become a tabula rasa, a blank slate. So the idea of the tabula rasa is still very common in first-year programs. Anytime you do an exercise like drawing straight lines or circles, that's from the Bauhaus curriculum. It's intended to help you reprogram your muscles. Second characteristic of the Bauhaus that remains in current first-year art instruction is visual sensitivity. Here, the idea was that as an artist, you need to be maximally sensitive to the world. The best example of this, the one that's most widely known, is Josef Albers' Lessons on Color. This is his book, Interaction of Color. He himself claimed that he could distinguish 2 billion colors, And apparently read somewhere that scientifically it seems to be the actual limit of human ability, 2 million different colors. But the assumption was behind that more sensitive artists are better artists. So the idea of the Albers book is to make you sensitive to color so that that part of your practice will be better than it would have been. There's a lot of ways to argue against this. There's a line in which Picasso said something like, they think, meaning like the public thinks painters use lots of colors, but really we use only 4 or 5. It's certainly true that a lot of different kinds of art don't depend on sensitivity. So as you do sensitivity exercise, you might ask yourself if those exercises really are connected to your practice or not. Do you need to be sensitive to color? Or, there are many of these other exercises, texture exercises and value exercises and motion exercises. Do you need to be sensitive to those things? Because not every art practice does need to be sensitive to the full range of the visual world. Okay, and the third characteristic of the Bauhaus that remains in first-year instruction is the sequence from 2D to 4D. It's important to know that this sequence is not universal, it's not transcultural, it's not transhistorical, it actually comes from modernism in the 1920s. And the modernists got it from scientists. It actually comes from the vogue for Einstein, basically. It comes from the 3 dimensions in space-time, X, Y, Z, T. That's all that. When Einstein first came to people's popular awareness, there was a lot of talk among Picasso and others about relativity and so on. And the 2D, 3D, 4D sequence is an example of that kind of conceptualization. So it's something that's very specific to modernism and even to the 1920s. So people have internalized it, though, because it's so common. So it's really common to hear things like, I'm great at 3D, but I can never get 4D, that kind of thing. So people internalize it in the sense that they come to believe it's just naturally true, and you can start to think of like your strengths and limitations in terms of 2D, 3D, 4D. But since it is really from a specific historical time and place, you might want to also think of that skeptically. It's also assumed that there's a right order for learning, first 2D, then 3D, then 4D. But assumptions like these might not be right for you. It's hard to say why you should think art is arranged in that way when there weren't even these Ds at all before the 1920s in the ways that people thought about art. And I like to think of it in a sort of Zen way, because you could think of starting out a curriculum with 4D, you could do some time art stuff, and then work your way to 3D, do sculptures, then to 2D, do a drawing, and end up with 1D, which would be like a line, or 0D, a point, something like that. Because who's to say those things aren't the hardest? That would be a kind of Zen attitude. Okay, so by way of conclusion, on the incoherence of the first-year program, the French Academy, the Romantic Academies, the Bauhaus, and these post-war art schools that I haven't talked about here, they all have different philosophies and purposes and exercises, and they're all mixed in the first year. And nobody has a theory about how the entire first year should work. There is no consensus authority or book or books to go to that describe how the first year should be coherent or how it all hangs together, because historically or conceptually. So it's a good idea to just keep your eye out for different kinds of instruction in order to think about how you might assemble them, what parts and pieces you might be able to use to influence your own practice. Maybe your art practice needs things from the French Academy, maybe it needs things from the Bauhaus, maybe it needs other combinations, but these are your fragments to assemble in whatever way you see fit.